we are back on the 0 Hour. I, as always, am your host, Richard RJ Eskow. The great Marxist thinker Antonio Gramsci famously hated New Year's. He said, "No spiritual time serving. I would like every hour of my life to be new, though connected to the ones that have passed." He added, "I await socialism for this reason too." The folks at Jacobin have done us the good work of reprinting that commentary. Check it out if you like. And joining me now to discuss the arbitrary chunk of time that's passed and the one that we now stand at the cusp of is our good friend Richard Wolff, who needs no introduction. He hosts Economic Update. He is a economist and economic historian and the author of a number of books, the latest of which is The Sickness is the System. So without any further ado, Richard Wolff, welcome back to The Problem and Happy New Year anyway.
Yes, exactly. It's if Gramsci is on your mind, he always had that wonderful remark when asked about his view. He answered, I'm a pessimist of the intellect, and I'm an optimist of the will, of the desire. And that captures probably as well as anything might the mood of this time that we're living through as we enter what is effectively the third year of this COVID pandemic. And for me, if I had to answer, and I've been asked this question, what is the most of all the things grabbing our attention these days? What is the one you would somehow designate as the most arresting of them all? And my answer, which might be a starting point for us, is not the condition of the United States and the world economy, which is what I study. It's not that. What it is the way in which particularly the leading organs of public thought in the United States are in what psychologists call a state of denial, a determination not to see what's going on and to substitute an altogether different rendition of what is happening than anything I can recognize as other than denial. As denial goes, it's fairly classic, but it is an example that the textbooks should make note of because it'll be a way to teach people for generations just how serious denial can be and what a role it can play in a society's unraveling.
Somehow that that denial that you describe, which is so pronounced and I think genuine, right? I mean,
yes.
My impression is that the people who are doing this are not just cynically manipulating the rest of us, although there's an element of that. They seem to genuinely believe it, which also brings to mind, I can't remember who said it now. Sometimes I think it was Disraeli, sometimes Upton Sinclair, but you cannot convince a man of something when his livelihood depends on not being convinced of it, or words to that effect. That whole sense that we have an entire governing superstructure on the world population of people whose livelihood and sense of self-worth depends on not understanding what is happening to us in the present moment. That's my thought.
Yeah, no, I see it all around me. I mean, we can do it. Let me mention a few examples. I mean, just to bring it home. We have had, the United States I'm speaking of now, we've been engaged in three major wars over the last quarter century, basically, a little more than that. The war in Vietnam, the war in Afghanistan, and the war in Iraq. The United States lost all three of these. That is, if you look at whatever the objective might have been, and there were many that were stated, it wasn't very clear. But given what they mostly were in Vietnam, to preserve the government of South Vietnam as an alternative to the Communist Party's government in North Vietnam, that has to be judged a failure. The whole world sees it as a failure. Even Americans who have a little bit of objectivity left understand that. The Afghanistani thing, which was designed, I assume, to be a defeat of the Taliban and all that represented, that's obviously a failure. That war was lost. Took 20 years, much longer than the Vietnam one, but it's lost. And if you follow the details of what's going on in Iraq, that war was already lost. It only lacks the final chapter of withdrawal, the way Biden withdrew the United States earlier last year from Afghanistan. That ought to be a wake-up call, but it isn't, because there's a kind of denial of what it means that I just said. And it isn't a response adequate to the situation to say, well, it wasn't a loss because all that money spent on those wars flowed into the pockets of American corporations. All of that's true, but that's not what wars, are all about. That is, they're partly that, but they're also partly efforts to shape events in other countries, right, from that be different from what they would otherwise have been, to the advantage of the United States. And I don't see one shred of evidence that was achieved, and lots of evidence that it was failed. And I'll give you the second one that's
well, before you move on, if you can remember the second one, I want to offer one point of criticism to your first observation, if I may, which is I think it's far too kind to the American military system, because I think you're far too generous to them, because I think that, in fact, if you look at the three major conflicts of the last 25, 30, 40 years, they not only have failed to achieve the desired objective, they have actually had the opposite result from the desired objective. That Vietnam was 50% communist when the U.S. got involved there. Now it's 100% communist. The Middle East is far more. The Taliban was offering, working on terms of surrender. Now they control Afghanistan. The collapse of Libya and Iraq led to, I mean, we could go down the line, but I would actually say they achieved the opposite of their intended goals and yet experienced no sense of either discouragement or interest in reevaluation and self-examination. I mean, fair?
Absolutely fair. I mean, and again, the denial of all what that implies and what that tells you about the so-called intelligence services that were supposed to have shown us the way to be successful winners of hearts and minds. But all of it was as phony as the famous, precision bombs were phony, or the fact that our drones kill more people having picnics and weddings than doing any other activity that can be ascertained. I mean, on and on and on. It's an endless story that a reasonable mentality would look at as challenges for being honest, because it's too risky to continue in the fantasy life that these wars demonstrate our military leaders and others were involved in. But COVID for me is also an amazing thing. I keep repeating this statistic, which I think in the end will shape our history in profound ways. The United States is 4.5% of the world's population, and we account for, 16, 17, 18% of the world's COVID deaths. One of the richest countries in the world with the most developed one of the most developed medical systems that we know of on this planet, not in terms of its coverage, but in terms of its education and skill level and machinery and knowledge and scientific grounding. Put it all together, this is a level of failure that is colossal. I mean, one of the first things any economic system has to deliver to be justified in the minds of its people is public health. If you can't keep your people alive, or at least healthy, then there is something basically wrong. But we don't have a conversation about the roots, the causes of the failure. We are busy celebrating that we got vaccinated, even though our leaders delayed that process in a shameless way. But we also don't understand that the minute you look at this with any kind of objectivity, we are less vaccinated than most other developed countries in the world. We're not even close. We have internal debates about vaccination that other countries find incomprehensible in terms of what is going on in this society. We actually permit a significant part of our society to refuse to face these questions that my statistics just now force into the mind of a reasonable person. We have displaced it. Alongside denial is usually displacement. You deny the reality and you displace your concept of reality onto a fantasy. Here's the fantasy, that what we're engaged in is a great struggle of the people to be free of the dictatorship of the government that wants to mandate things to them. I mean, I'm the first one to be suspicious of the government and to look with a frown upon dictatorships or mandates, which are synonyms in this situation. But a mandate to keep yourself healthy, a mandate to avoid a disease that everyone else in the world understands is at least assuaged by these vaccines. And I don't put aside, there are good questions to be asked about the pharmaceuticals and all
Sure.
correct. But the idea that this is about mandates, that the very people who are yelling about mandates didn't say boo when the government inoculated their new baby with a smallpox vaccine, and don't say boo when the traffic light policeman tells them, if you go through this intersection when the light is red, I am going to arrest you because you have violated the mandate that the government created by that traffic light. And the rationale is always the same. We restrict your liberty for the greater liberty of everybody else. You don't want to go through the intersection if other people are free to ignore the red light because it'll kill you and your baby in the back seat. I mean, this is not an advanced debate. This is a desperate effort of everybody who's a Republican and all the libertarians gathered together in the auditorium where they might gather. I'm trying to be polite here, to try to get the conversation to where they can repeat their fantasies about government mandates on something that is not relevant to that question and is a substitute for what the urgent issue is. Even if you have, as some of my friends do, great questions about the vaccine and about I don't like mandates either. There's no need for the mandate. Employers and employees can get together and work out a mutually acceptable way of doing this. But we know, whatever you think about all of that, we know that our hospitals are now incapable of dealing with regular diseases. I have friends here in New York City where I live who have been turned away from hospitals because it's too dangerous. The hospital tells them, A, we don't have room for you, but even if we did, you might want to think about it because we're full of COVID people here and you're at great risk. Whoa, that means we don't have hospitals enough? That means I hear about labor shortages. Nurses are quitting, doctors are quitting. All of them are saying they're exhausted. Why? Because we have no backup program in this country. When soldiers get exhausted, they're replaced by fresh recruits. Every army knows that because of that. But of course, it's true for medical personnel too. What kind of a system is not solving that problem, but yowling about worker shortages? That's what an economy is for, to not have those things. To blame the individual, well, that's a terrible joke and solves nothing because these are structural problems. And again, I get nothing but denial and celebrations that we have great scientists or we developed the vaccine. First of all, we didn't develop the vaccine early. We developed it late. We developed it late because we have a private vaccine system. And the government had to guarantee with subsidies that went to many of the companies and with a guarantee of orders, hundreds of millions of orders for a vaccine at a price that would boom the profits of the producer. The government gave them a guaranteed market. I mean, this is the joke here is only that not only is all of that denied, more denial, but you substitute the fantastic notion, isn't our private medical system wonderful? What? Wonderful.
And let me,
yeah, go ahead.
let me, this is such a great topic for this moment, right now, in my view, for a lot of reasons. But one of them is, of course, everything you're saying about the private medical delivery system, and we could do hours on that alone. But to me, I am extremely fascinated by and horrified by the way it's playing out in terms of vaccine non-compliance in our population. It seems to me, and your thought is very active on the sort of border of economics and psychology and social science and so on. It seems to me that's where the crux of the problem lies, because we have, on what I would call the democratic side of the fence, I think it's triggering a lot of the worst cultural habits and political inclinations of that group. Look, give me a second, if you would, to explain what I mean, which is there's been very little self-examination among the elites in this country about why it would be that such large percentages of the country might refuse the vaccine. People can do the wrong things based on impulses, to me, that are rooted in natural reactions. People feel they've been lied to. They have been lied to. People feel pharmaceutical companies are rapacious and the government doesn't put their lives and safety first. True, and true. The fact that it manifests in suspicion of vaccines, tragic for them and for others, for everyone. But to me, it's all been about holding people who don't take and I'm not talking about the cynical manipulators of public opinion on the right. I'm talking about the ordinary people who are afraid. It's very easy for, pardon the cliche, liberal elites to say, well, they're deplorables, they deserve what they get. It's too bad they have to make us sick. Instead of saying, what is it about our ideology and the way we manage the world that has caused such hostility, suspicion, and mistrust, and how can we fix it? Well, I'll conclude my rant there, but what do you think of that interpretation?
I'm 110% in agreement. I think that's exactly right. And that's, I think, why the denial happens. Because the alternative to denial goes in your direction and ends up with pointing the finger at us, that there's something going on in this society that makes millions and millions of people, many of whom are smart people and thoughtful people and decent and well-intentioned and all of that, make them take a position that is, in my judgment, wildly misconstruing what's bothering them. But they are genuinely bothered, and by things they ought to be bothered by. I agree with you. For me, the classic example, now it'll be COVID, but it was until recently Brexit. Right. In the aftermath of the great crash of 2008 and 9, the working class of an advanced country that was the most savaged by austerity were the British. The real wages in Britain went down 10, 15% over the decade after 2008, which is a worse performance than you had in the United States or most of Western Europe. They really took it on the chin. The conservatives who brought them that austerity, who imposed it on them, then turned around and took advantage of the misery and the bitterness and the anger. The anger, by the way, devoted to the Labour Party too, because they endorsed the following crazy idea that neoliberalism, having to get the government out was some sort of advance, which it never was. It was a retreat. But the end result was the conservatives said, you're very angry, and here's where you should be with your anger. You should be angry at the Europeans. What? The French, the Germans, the Italians, the Swedish. What? You just get rid of them, you see, and all will be better. Well, they got rid of them. They voted for the Brexit in 2016, and the economy in England and the condition of the working class have been on a downward slide ever since. And down for the British is now becoming difficult because they're already so far and so low. And you can see it in their government. We don't have a Mr. Trump. They still have a Boris Johnson, although he's hanging on by the skin of his teeth and probably won't last much longer. But there's your example of a justified anger being shunted off into a right-wing outcome that gives the conservatives another few years to dominate Britain and to take it even deeper into the hole that it is digging for itself. We are doing exactly the same thing. And to then say to the American working class, half of you lost your income for a while during the 2020, 2021. Over half the American working class, the labor force, was unemployed for some of that time, some of them for the whole time. That's unspeakable, half your working class out of work. There was no need for that. That didn't happen in any of the Western European countries. We did that to our working class. And we imposed on them a level of sickness and death that should never have happened, and in many other countries did not, in fact, happen. And then we hit them with an inflation. No sooner are you out from under the unemployment and you're trying to cope with all that you got hurt by during the pandemic, and we're now going to jack up the prices in our society that you have to pay by 7-8%, which is the rate at which we are now watching consumer prices rise. And then you get to what in many ways is the greatest denial of all, which is a denial of what an inflation is. An inflation is when prices go up. All right, let's do economics 101. How conveniently forgotten. Who sets prices in a capitalist economy? Answer. A tiny minority of people known as the employer. For those of you who are listening and watching, you're an employee, 99% likely, because 99% of people involved are employees. The employers is 1%. In your job description as an employee, you may have noticed, if you're very acute, that the job setting the price of whatever it is I help to produce is not among your duties. You don't do that. In fact, the employer jealously withholds from the workers any involvement in determining the price. So the employer does that, which means if we have an inflation, it's because the employer class raised the prices. There's no other way to do that. And then we have the following spectacle, which for me as a teacher is really taking it kind of over the edge. We watch the people who alone have the responsibility for raising prices turn to us, the people they are fleecing with their rising prices, and explain to us that it's somebody else's fault. What? Oh, well, I have to do that because there have been disruptions in the supply chain. I mean, this needs to be called out for what it is, somewhere between bullshit and stupidity. I don't know exactly where. I'm sure it's a mixture for most of us, but wow. Or my workers are getting more wages. Every textbook in economics, even the ones we use in this country, explain to students that when a cost goes up, that doesn't necessarily mean an employer can pass the higher cost on in a higher price. He may like to do that, but that's not, he doesn't have to. There are lots of ways of responding to rising costs if you have them. And the capitalist who chooses to respond by raising the price has then the responsibility for the rising price, We are living in a society in which the role of the capitalist, the 1%, who have the right, which we shouldn't allow, to set the prices 100% of us pay, 1% decided to raise them. And they did it for the same reason they do everything else, because it's profitable. They've learned to raise prices if and when the market will allow them to profit by doing so. That's their reason. They will tell you that after 2 martinis, or in many cases, only 1. And we should be accepting their argument, except they don't want us to when it's not politically convenient. And then we should blame, I don't know, something mysterious like a broken supply chain, or maybe the Chinese, or who knows, maybe those poor Central American immigrants can come in for some more blame for stuff they have nothing to do with.
And, it's interesting because since you and I last talked about inflation, Richard Wolff, I've seen a couple, I would say, patronizingly written pieces explaining, well, there's this thing going around that says inflation is because employers have raised wages. Well, let me tell you how this works. I've seen a couple things like this, and they go back to something else we were taught in Economics 101. Inflation is too much money chasing too few goods, right? But one of the things that leaves out, it seems to me, and obviously I want your thoughts, of the many things it leaves out, is monopolization. And, if I'm Lucy, right, a lemonade 5 cents, and there's 6 other peanut characters, right, Peanuts characters buying my lemonade. If I raise it to 10 cents, it doesn't mean the other Peanuts characters got more money. It just means I decided to charge 10 cents and I'm the only lemonade stand in town. Does monopoly, folksy analogy, sorry, but does monopolization play a role in all this?
Absolutely. And let me say first 2 things. One, the greatest increase in the money supply that this country has ever seen in peacetime has been going on, but it's been going on for 15 to 20 years, during which we had record low inflation. So even a moron with some awareness would understand that you've got a big problem explaining why we have inflation now, when for the last 15 years, we've had often more rapid monetary increase and no inflation. So obviously, like most scientists, you would realize that the money can't be the explanation, because you got those years of money creation as fast as more than this one, and you don't have an inflation. That's number one. Number 2, monopoly. Of course, every capitalist, whether you started a little business or a medium business, or you're in the right family, so you get to start at the top, like most of our CEOs do, whatever your situation, what your goal is, sooner or later, is to what's called grab market share. That is to become a bigger player in whatever industry, shoemaking or software production or hamburgers, whatever it is. And you hope one day to become one of the few big mega companies. You want to be General Motors or Ford if you're in auto, or the way Mr. Biden picked out of the blue last week the meat processing industry, pointing out that 4 of the companies there account for 80 or 85% of all meat processing, which is true enough, but it's true across the board. That's what capitalism is. It trains capitalists to struggle for market share, to become one of either the only one left or one of the 2 or 3 big ones, because then they can get together and jack up the price, because we, the public, have nowhere else to go. They control such a big share of the market. That's what they're there for. Of course, we have an inflation in part because they're in a position to do that, which they struggle through the history of their corporation to get into that position, which is why antitrust in this country is a silly joke. You're setting up a government agency that's there to stop what the whole system is committed to achieve. Guess what? The system wins, and the the laws become a dead letter because you can't solve your problem by merely passing a law. You got to deal with the underlying system, which this country denies is an issue, let alone a problem.
And all the people who laughed at Silicon Valley venture capitalists for investing in these stupid firms that had nothing original, the last laugh is on them, because the strategy all along was to capture monopoly market share. Absolutely. And then squeeze every nickel they could get. I was never about the quality of the product. So I know you have to go. If you have one more minute, I will add just that at the end of the year saw the conviction on 4 charges of former Theranos CEO Elizabeth Holmes. And I have watched with great amusement as the investment community, especially in California, insists that this is not how we do business, and that the hucksterism and dishonesty and fraud practiced by Ms. Holmes would not pass muster with us and is not how we conduct business. But of course, many of them gave her money, and she seems to me to epitomize the ultimate model of the modern capitalist. But I will let you have the last word, sir.
Well, that's very kind of you. Yeah, I mean, you could predict that the sun will rise in the next few days, and that anyone who gets caught has the bad taste to get caught, as Elizabeth Holmes did, will be pilloried by her associates as if she were that rare bad apple in an otherwise wonderful collection of fresh fruit. I mean, it is, the script has been written 1,000 times. The only really interesting thing is how these people with a straight face can repeat this tired old BS yet again. All kinds of the leaders of Silicon Valley poured money into this woman. They all have specialized firms, accountants, economists like me, lawyers. I've done this work, doing what's called due diligence before they give a nickel to any of these people. There are procedures to go through, documents to review, affidavits to be signed. I noticed that on the board of her corporation was somebody whose genius ought always to be reminding us of the wisdom of our leaders. Henry Kissinger lent his name to facilitate her getting money. She got money because she had the right association. Everyone on Silicon Valley does that. Every startup that goes anywhere knows it's got to get the right athlete or the right politician or the right bank CEO on their board. The minute they do that, they glide into the money. No one that I'm aware of, a study that ever asked and answered the question. Take a group of people who started a business in an industry, really trace through from the early years when they were just getting going to, say, 20, 30 years later, and how many of them succeeded and became successful businesses, and how many died along the way, losing vast sums of the people who had been suckered in to buying it. If you did that kind of research, you'd discover that the price you pay for this system of managing innovation is very, very high. But that's why you need to hide this kind of research, because you need to deny the costs, because this is hucksterism. You point to people, like in any advertisement, you point to what the good news is, and you try to hide the bad news. But that's not honest. That's capitalism, but it's not honest.
Someday I'll tell you my Henry Kissinger story. It's just very revealing. But let's see. So on his resume, we've got Vietnam, Cambodia, and Theranos. That is the wise man of our culture. Go ahead.
No. And we will celebrate him forever, because he literally embodies, and I encountered him when I was an undergraduate. He was a teacher where I was going to school, and he will always represent how to create something out of nothing and how to sell it as something really extraordinary. I mean, you have to take your hat off. There's a certain artistic genius in doing this. And, that is what he has. But the rest of it, that's all make believe.
Henry Kissinger is deadly performance art. Well, we'll have to leave it there. But Richard Wolff, economist and historian, host of Economic Update. It's going to be an interesting year. Thanks so much for coming on the program, as always, and great to talk to you.
Thanks, you. And I'm liking the spirit with which we're having these conversations. It's a little more relaxed, but in a way, it gets at some of the roots of these issues. So thank you from me as well.
Thank you so much. I look forward to talking to you soon. And for the rest of us, we'll be talking to you very shortly after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour.